looked like until we had Lewis and Clark's expedition, and that began a conversation about how do we open the West. And we got something that looks like this. So this is a picture depicting manifest destiny. It was Europeans' destiny to discover America. And you can see they have the angelic figure laying out the telephone or telegraph lines. You have the Indian people getting pushed further and further to the west. You had the bear, the buffalo, the other resources also moving to the west. And of course, the sod busters, the immigrants coming in. And so ultimately that resulted in something that looked like this, and the red signifying various reservations throughout the West, and of course Oklahoma territory down, or Indian territory down in Oklahoma. Now it's interesting because much of this was done with treaties up to 1871. People were allowed to make treaties and get those treaties approved and ratified by Congress, and that's what established the bigger reservations. This is what's known as the Supremacy Clause in the Constitution. And the underlying parts there, all treaties made or which shall be made under the authority of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land. And so the question then becomes, how do you make any law that affects a treaty that's not unconstitutional? And this is, once they quit making the treaties, they came to some understanding that these treaties were going to be problematic, and they introduced treaty or reservation making through executive order. But if you read the executive order authorization, it says those are held at the same level as the treaties. Clearly, this did not happen. Treaties got violated regularly. I will tell you, this is, and this is a classic example of it, and one we had some good slides for. This is the Flathead Reservation in northwest Montana. It's occupied by the Kootenai and Salish tribes. They were two tribes that used this area fairly regularly, especially the Salish, the majority of the area, but the Kootenai folks were in the northwest part of the reservation and over into Idaho and eastern Washington. So in 1887, the Dawes General Allotment Act passed in Congress. And what the Allotment Act did was, on 150 reservations, 160 acres were divided out and given to the head of each Indian household. And in some cases, they were 320 acres, some cases 40 acres, 80 acres, 160 was most common. And this is what it looked like at Salish Kootenai. And as I said, the Salish folks were down in that kind of Central Valley area, and the Kootenai people selected their allotments up in the mountainous area on the west side of the reservation. This was one of those places where they had a friendly agent at the time who allowed them to select where they wanted their allotments. Some reservations were just assigned, and oftentimes assigned some of the poorer lands on the reservation. The other thing that happened with the Dawes General Allotment Act is once they had, everyone had their 160 acre allotment, the rest of the land on the reservation was declared in excess of Indian needs and taken by the federal government for pennies on the dollar and then sold to timber companies, mining companies, the railroads, and others. And these were lands that were retained in treaties for the exclusive use and occupation by Indian people. And the common language was something like, as long as the grass grows and the rivers flow. They put a few twists on some of them, but it had that exact type of wording in it. So the Salish Kootenai, the Flathead Reservation, once they had these allotments, they were open to both homesteading and other takings. And the state of Montana took a fair bit. Those are the more gray areas. The white areas are homesteaders coming into the area. And these were the major farmland area on the reservation. This is what it looks like today. You'll also notice the one purple blob there. That's the National Bison Range. Teddy Roosevelt decided there should be some preservation of buffalo. Actually two Indian farmers on the reservation already had buffalo herds. They thought once the federal government had them, they would probably be destroyed or go away. And so they moved their buffalo to Canada. Later, when they established this bison range, they brought those buffalo back down. The interesting part of that story is the federal government fought having the tribes manage the bison range, and said that even conservation groups came out and said the Indian people will kill these buffalo and eat them. And I mean, you don't herd a whole bunch of bison to Canada and then bring them back down just to shoot them. I mean, you could do that anywhere, right? No, these were buffalo. They were part of the culture of the Salish Kootenai people. And finally, in the last few years, the last 4 years, total control of the bison range has now gone over to the tribe after years of fighting over it. I tell you all this because this past 3 weeks we launched a treaty signers website, and it tells you how the treaties were made and who signed them. And it's if you have time to go to our website, there's a link to the new website for the treaty signers. The stories are like rabbit holes, right, on the web. You start reading it and they're linked together. So one family may have signed 30 treaties. In fact, one family in St. Louis controlled the entire fur trade west of St. Louis through treaties, but also violated those treaties. There's a store, I think there are 1,200 signers on the 400 and some treaties, and the interrelationship between who's signing those treaties and what businesses were then started or continued is quite fascinating, including all sorts of fraud and other loss. It's fairly significant. I would invite you to go there, but if you go there, take some time, set aside some time, do it in the evening sometime when you're kicking around saying, So closer to home, Leech Lake Reservation. This is perhaps the quintessential outcome of the General Allotment Act. So Leech Lake went through the allotment process under the Nelson Act in Minnesota, which covered all the reservations in Minnesota. This is the Leech Lake Reservation after the Allotment Act was put in place. There are a few things that you'll notice on here. The massive yellow color is the land that went into the Minnesota or the U.S. Forest Service and the Chippewa National Forest. That happened because no one really wanted the land at Leech Lake, apparently, or they couldn't sell enough of it to timber companies at first. And so the federal government put it in the federal estate. The blue, that's the second most on there, happens to be the state forest. And this is where there's been some consolidation of the school lands. So even if you had a reservation, when a state was authorized to come into existence, every 16 and 36 section within the township and range were designated school lands and were put in place to help support the public schools. Today we have, and then later, even more of that land got transferred if the state began to take possession of it, and it would go into something similar to the trust, but it would go to the state. All the income would go to the state. Today, the University of Minnesota, for instance, probably takes in anywhere from $2.5 to $3 million a year off of these lands. In other cases, it's much larger than that. And basically, the land-based universities, the land-grant universities, are at least supported by some 10 to 15% of their income off of Indian lands throughout the country. You know, and I tell you that because there's, I mean, it has all these, we don't have time to go into all the economics behind this, but oftentimes in the past you've heard, geez, Leech Lake's got all that land, why aren't they a more wealthy tribe? Well, this is so that you can see this highlighted. This is what the red dots on the map are, what the Leech Lake Indian Nation, the band, and individual Indians still hold on the reservation. It's actually, and we help them through some research, be able to go to Congress and get 17,000 acres of the national forest back. But that grew their ownership from 4% to about 8%. And the rest has been alienated from Indian ownership, management, and control. These are the types of projects and programs and sites that the foundation works on constantly with others. Other tribes, like you saw the Salish Kootenai piece, they're all checkerboarded. And so there's Indian ownership, there's non-Indian ownership, side by side and all over the place. That's what gives it the checkerboarding. Makes it especially difficult for the tribes and even for the counties and states to manage or have jurisdictions that are confused like that. And it's been that way now for 160 years. And it really costs, if you look at a local economy, it costs lots of money to manage those jurisdictions that are all messed up. And this is a quick table. And I should tell you, if you want copies of the slides, I'll be more than happy to send you the whole presentation. We are about education first and foremost, and so having people understand these pieces is important to us. And we've often said at the staff level, if we could just get people not to fight us, we'd be happy. Yeah.
That person either doesn't understand it or doesn't want to understand it. You know, I mean, frankly, Grand Casino is one of the greatest revenges that Native Americans have ever taken on white people. Use the mic. You know what I'm saying? Oh,
yeah.
Oh, okay, sorry. It's on. Can you hear me? Oh,
yep.
There you go. Okay, kiss the mic. Anyway, my question was, do you also have written materials? Because it's not enough to just have slides. It has to be interpreted for people who either can't or don't want to understand it. And the implications, you know, how far does this go out? Because I think there's a point where, just like African Americans, you know, how do you do reparations for something so massive? We have to figure out a way to make that work, and we have to do it for all the peoples, not just here, but all over the world. You know, every single country has someone who is a native, and all the natives have always been misused. So how do we change that? How do we change the math, if you will?
Yeah, and I have to apologize. I was on the road on Friday, and I had intended to bring handouts for you all.
Don't apologize.
We have all kinds of materials that we've done over the years, and we have a card that allows you to do your phone thing, that little square thing, and you can get access to it. I just didn't get back to the office since Friday. But we can make a lot of material available, and you can go on there and you can order any of the pieces you want. We have the history in a couple of different message runner issues that we put out. We also have some specific ones. We did one on right-of-ways and easements when the couple of pipeline issues came up that were out and very hot at the time. People needed to understand where there were, in fact, right-of-ways and easements and how they were done. And much of that, again, goes back to some of the economics of the situations and what it takes to do projects on reservations. But we have a lot of that material, and you can go online, you can look at all of it online, or you can let us know and we'll mail you a package. We also have one thing you won't be able to read online very easily. We have a timeline poster that has policies, what's going on in the public at the time, that dates from prior to the Allotment Act to up to today. But it's a poster, it's the size of this screen basically. And we roll it up, mail it out in tubes. We send it out, probably 50 to 60 of them a week.
So where are you getting your funding to do that?
Well, all over. And part of it is we have an endowment that we were started with by Northwest Area Foundation for $20 million. That was supposed to be our operating cost for the first 10 years, but we treated it like a partial endowment. So we invested it, and we've been successful in investing it. We run about 9% per year in terms of an annualized performance. We get funds from foundations that are interested in certain topics. We get some amount of money from the federal government, although I have to tell you, if we do one more federal government grant, I will have no hair left on my head. And and it's just worse all the time.
Maybe you're going to address it later. However, are you going to talk at all about our lands owned by the tribe or by individual members of the tribe and that whole dynamic?
Yeah, well, we might as well talk a little bit about it right now. So in order to do what they wanted to do with the Dawes General Allotment Act, they declared all Indian people and the tribes incompetent to handle their own affairs. And in doing that, they then took the land into trust. And so the 160 acres was held in trust for the beneficial use by Indian people. But the underlying ownership is really the federal government. Same with the tribes, and there was actually very little land left for the tribes coming out of the Allotment Act. And so the tribes since then have accumulated land by purchase basically, and some settlements on different pieces. But the tribes own roughly, I shouldn't say own, they have in trust roughly about 42 million acres. Individuals have about 10 million acres left. We lost 90 million acres total through the allotment process, and up until 1934 when that process stopped. Pretty much the major loss was by individual ownership. 1906, the Burke Act passed, which allowed for what they called competency commissions, who then went out to the reservation to determine if the Indian person was competent or not, and if they decided they were competent, their land went into fee status, away from trust status. And when it went into fee status, it was then under the county and state jurisdiction and could be taxed. And so what we ended up with was all this land going out of trust and into fee, and essentially sold on the county steps for taxes and tax foreclosures, because Indian people had no idea. In some cases, didn't even know it had been transferred to fee. In fact, my grandfather's, it looks as though my great-grandmother's allotment was lost when he went to World War I. And there were only a few ways you could be declared competent across the board. One was to join the military if you were a man. If you were an Indian woman and you married a white man, you were declared competent. It didn't work the other way. But the one that I think is most egregious, not just because it was affecting our family, but to go to serve in the military in World War I for the United States, and then to have their lands taken, that's just appalling to me. So that's kind of the breakdown of tribal and individual lands that are still held.
I just wanted to add one more thing on that. For people who saw the film Killers of the Flower Moon, you may or may not be aware, the Osage people were the richest people in the world. In the world. And the women were being treated that way. They were incompetent unless they married a white man. And the character played by Robert De Niro, that is what he did. He talked all these young white men into marrying the natives so they could get their land, and then they killed them off, systematically killed off the women to get the land. So, this is just, it's just beyond comprehension. I'm sorry.
It is. I didn't think we would have time for all of that, so I took out a fair bit. But I can explain this. So, because you're incompetent, you're unable to write a will. So until 1924, when Indian people were declared U.S. citizens, and post that point, there was a question about could Indian people write a will since they were U.S. citizens or not. Otherwise, it all fell under, they were filed as intestate probates when an allottee would die. And they had a process for designating who got the shares. The 160 acres allotments, the land stayed in trust, but the title divided. And so eventually you'd have a generation, you'd have one owner, they would pass, and that would go to their children and their spouse in a division method. And so you'd have now 5 owners. Let's say if they had 4 kids, you'd have 5 owners. And the next generation would pass, and you'd have 15, 20, 25 owners. And this thing just kept multiplying out. We were talking earlier, and this gets to the point where you can have, and you do have, thousands of owners on 160 acres. The question is, how do you manage that? So today we're sitting here with, 45, 50 people, right? And so if this room was 160 acres, now I have to get, once you get over 20 owners, you have to get 50% of the ownership to agree on how you're going to manage that land. Things like who's going to live in grandma's house, who's going to live on the land, who's going to farm it, who's going to ranch it. And it really became a point where it was much easier for people to lease the land out to non-Indians than it was to try and decide among their family. It's not just all of you, right? Imagine you're all related, and you bring all the baggage of being related to the table. I think about that given my own family and siblings, and there are 2 of them that I wouldn't agree with no matter if hell froze over tomorrow. And so it really becomes, it's not just that the land was alienated to non-Indians, but it also became unmanageable. We have literally millions of acres in Indian country that if they aren't leased out to non-Indians, they're lying fallow, and no one's using them at all. And that's probably one of the bigger impediments we have in Indian country. And I got some slides at the end. If we had time, I'd show those to you. But it's really gotten to the point, in fact, I was saying, the smallest undivided interest that I've seen in Indian land is 1/32 million. And for 160 acres. So it's essentially, if you look at the parquet floor here, it's one of those squares on 160 acres. They're undivided, so while you're sitting in chairs, and you could say, well, this is my chair, they can't do that. They can't say, this is my acre of land. And the process to ever get there is probably 7 to 8 years to even subdivide a property.
Is Red Lake different?
Is Red Lake?
Red Lake Reservation, is it different from these others?
It is. Red Lake's got a great story on one hand, on the other hand, it's not so great. So the government folks show up at Red Lake to talk about allotment and get the 7 chiefs to agree to go through allotment process. And the 7 chiefs had been watching this on the other reservations and said, no. And they disappeared. And they stayed disappeared until the guys from the government left. And then they came back. And then the government guys heard they were back. So they went back up to Red Lake and they were gone. And so, I mean, this went on for a little bit, and then they had discussions around finalizing a treaty. Today, and you probably read this in the newspaper, Red Lake is going to the Department of Interior to get back the upper half of Red Lake, which was, it was agreed at the treaty that the tribe, the band, would not sign the treaty unless both lakes were within the boundary of the reservation and a mile as a buffer around it. Rand McNally was there and made the map. Between Red Lake and St. Paul, the map disappeared and a new map was presented to Congress that cut off the upper half of Upper Red Lake. And we've helped them with some of the history on this. We helped them collect all the information from various courts and testimonies that were done. And it's very clear there were people who testified in the 1930s that they were at the treaty making and that the tribes had been very clear that both lakes needed to be included. And it's an egregious taking. On the other part around the allotments, no, they never went through the allotment period. The land at Red Lake is wholly owned by the band.
Has this historical process been similar in Canada?
No, Canada is interesting. They actually treat their natives somewhat better in some ways. And they're right now in treaty making with the Canadian government. They've also taken steps forward to not take land into a trust status. And so it's primarily tribal land. The tribes up there, or the First Nations up there, they do assignments and they do long-term leases to their tribal members for use. And they also have the ability to sell their land if they want. We work closely with folks out of Kamloops on projects, and at Kamloops, they actually sell land to non-First Nations people and then use those proceeds to buy more land. And at the same time, they have the ability to tax And so they can tax non-natives on land, and it gives them a source of revenue. There are any number of differences to all that.
Chris, hi. Well, you just started into that, actually, to talk about what the Indian Land Tenure Foundation does, because it's very exciting. And we were reminded, 12 years ago, I went to a presentation of yours where you had just participated with Shakopee and others, I'm sure, to buy back the largest ranch in the Black Hills. The most exciting thing I heard in a long time. But I assume there's more of that. Well, partly you just touched on it with the Kamloops, but can you talk about what you guys do on the reacquisition side?
Let me tell you what we do, since that's where we're at on the screen. So we do education was the first, when we got started, the question was, where do you go from here? And we decided, well, we need kind of a movement to really get the thing going. How do movements in the U.S. start? They start with kids. And the kids get educated, and they take that home to their parents and educate their parents on anti-smoking, recycling, all these different movements. So we started with creating a curriculum around Indian land. And so we have a curriculum that runs, at first it ran for K through 12. And then we got a proposal to do a coloring book for pre-K kids. And so we did the coloring book. And then we got a proposal to do tribal college level courses, university level courses. And we have all those curriculums in place. At the elementary, from K through 12, it's taught in about 2,600 different schools across the country. It was taught in the St. Paul School District broadly for 3 different levels. The one through K through 6, and then 7, 8, and 9, and then the high school level. The problem we have with it a little bit is there will be a driver. There will be a teacher who's interested in telling the story and having the documentation to show it. If that person leaves, oftentimes it hits the skids. And so we now also train teachers on it. And we've trained, I think, maybe 7,000 teachers nationwide on the curriculum use. A teacher can stand in their classroom and on their phone get the lesson called up and be able to put it in place right away. So that's between that, talks like this, talks in the various locale across the country. We probably spend, even still today, we probably spend 60 to 70% of our time and resources on education. We spend lots of time on education with Indian people. As one guy said on the team that started the foundation, we've been disconnected so long from our land, we need to learn it. And it's true, even the cultural side of it. We did a grant, I don't know, back in 2003 or 2004, to an Oklahoma tribe who had an acorn dance. And they said, we want to know our culture and why we're doing an acorn dance when we don't have an oak tree within 100 miles of here. And it turns out they were one of the tribes that got removed from Ohio. But they brought that dance with them and did it in the fall religiously, but had to go back basically to Ohio to collect the acorns that they were going to use in the ceremony. It's that kind of education that, we are truly a land-based people. And whether it's a specific place or a region, we have a culture that's tied to that. And each tribe has a different culture tied to a different piece of ground, but that's largely what we are and what we spend a lot of time on. We also, I mentioned earlier, the fractionated title. In 2004, The federal government passed the American Indian Probate Reform Act, which carries with it a number of pretty onerous conditions if you don't have a will. And so we continue, when we can get the money to provide the services, we work with legal service groups and individual attorneys to provide will writing and estate planning for Indian people. Only 7%, I was asked the other day by the committee that I was testifying before, why do you only have 7% of Indian people with a will? And after 20 years of writing wills, the only answer I could give them was people die. Most of our clients are older. They recognize time is getting close, and so they get a will written. But then a year later, you have to replace that will with someone else. And so it's this continual thing. If you don't do enough of them in a mass scale to develop this tradition of having a will, and we have yet to have enough money to do a mass scale of this, then you're not getting to a point where everybody says to their neighbor, to their son, to others, you need a will, you need to write a will, and then we aren't going to get there. This will, the provisions within the American Indian Probate Reform Act, if we can't get some of that changed or get people to have wills, we'll see a loss of Indian land after the third generation of probably on the level of just about the level of the General Allotment Act. And so we're working as hard as we can to get that changed. But as I was telling Jackie, for 17 years, we've showed them that if we write the wills, they save administrative money. In fact, if they were to give us $66 million a year for 10 years, we could save the federal government $16 billion in administrative costs. What I was told once before was, Cris, if you can save them that much money, but you don't show them how to spend it, you'll never get it done because they're worried about keeping their budget at level X. And I said back, it's not my job to show them how to spend it. Yeah. Here we go. This is what happens through the division process. So the bar on the left there is the allottee, the original allottee, or someone who has inherited the entirety of an allotment. I have seen one of these in 22 years that I've been at the foundation. And it was a guy over at Cheyenne River. He was 80-some years old. He used to work at Valley Fair for years. And he wanted to sell his allotment to the buyback program. And they were trying to talk him out of it. They said, you've got a 1/1 here of ownership. And what would you do with the money? And he said, I want to go to Disneyland. He said, I heard about it for years when I worked at Valley Fair, and people goes, oh, you ought to see Disneyland. And I'm thinking, the guy's 80 years old, let him get the money and go to Disneyland. But this is the divisions and this only shows 6 generations. We're now in our 7th, 8th, or 9th generations. And I could show you slides on that all day. One of the things that we came to recognize fairly quickly was not every tribe, but many tribes have land offices that help manage the tribal lands as well as other activities, including acquisitions. And they had varying levels of sophistication and varying levels of understanding how policies played down to their reservation. And so we started a group called the National Tribal Land Association. We hold a conference every year of tribal land staffs. I think we are now at something like 320 different tribes have participated with their staff at the conference. We also run a program with the Intertribal Ag Council called the National Indian Carbon Coalition. We started this because when carbon markets started popping up, like every other market that pops up, then we get the fly-by-nighters coming into Indian country and going to sell people a bill of goods. And we said, you know, we need to educate the tribes and Indian people about what these carbon markets really mean and what the potential is. We set out to make this an educational piece. Pretty quick, we were asked to actually do the projects. And so the first two projects we did, Fond du Lac in northeast Minnesota and Kewanee Bay over in the UP of Michigan. We now are doing, I think, right at either 10 or 12, depending, well, I think we maybe are now over that. But we've been able to demonstrate that you can not only preserve your trees and your environment, you can get paid for it through the carbon markets. And so we did a major project at Boys Fort and helped the Boys Fort folks recover 28,000 acres of land from PotlatchDeltic, the timber company. That 28,000 acres of land will be paid for by the Sustainable Forest Initiative from the state of Minnesota, and the carbon market will pay the rest for the 28,000. And the band won't have to take anything out of their pocket to do it. To us, that's the holy grail. You know, otherwise what we're looking at is the tribes, and you'll hear this, we're buying back our own land. and I agree, but, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. So this is the Indian Land Capital Company, which is a for-profit subsidiary of Indian Land Tenure Foundation. We started this with a woman named Eloise Cabell to show people that the tribes were good credit risks. And we finance the purchase of land back to the tribes, and we do it at full faith and credit of the tribes. So we treat the tribes as sovereign nations. We don't require collateral, and we sure don't require that they put the land up as collateral. Once they get the land back, we aren't going to be putting it at risk again. 15 years when we started this, people told us we'd be out of business in a year because we'd never get paid back. We have yet to have a default on any land, on any tribal land that we financed. The tribes, as we finally got the USDA to understand, the tribes will fight you tooth and nail for the land piece once they have it. They'll work out a deal with you on money. That money doesn't mean anything to them. The land is what means it. And so when we got an allocation from USDA, they finally wrote it as, you must do these as full faith and credit general obligation to the tribe. And it's like, they discovered it. We have Indian Land Capital Company currently has about $30 million out in loans and another about 30 to be able to be lent out shortly.
Excuse me, I'm just going to break in to say that we have maybe 2 or 3 minutes left, so we're going to give that to you and not ask any more questions.
Well, let me blaze then. Spirit of Sovereignty Foundation, we took this over for fund. We now call it a fund. Took it over from the National Indian Gaming Association to run. We do scholarships, and we also do a Christmas program for kids on the Great Plains, where we primarily boys and girls clubs and others who are distributing, and they do one article of clothing and one article of food, and or a gift to the individual kids. The one that really tore me up was the little boy who wrote, and I'll get back to it. This is the one you were talking about, was Peshwa. This was 8 tribes came together. We managed the funds for it. We were holding a fair amount of money to get this done before it went to auction. The family who had homesteaded this back in the late 1800s had subdivided it. They were going to put in a number of mini mansions and small ranches. It's about 3,000 acres. This is where the Lakota star knowledge originated, was on this prairie, and it's called Peshwa, the heart of everything. If you look at a map or a satellite imagery of the Black Hills, this is where the heart would be on a buffalo. And it's stunning to me that somehow, without satellite, this is where everything came to. And I have always found that to be impressive. This is our version of the Manifest Destiny picture. So I gave a talk like this one night, and we had not all of the audiences that I talked to are sitting there nodding their heads. Usually, a lot of them are. And so I came away from this business group that I talked to about it, was still kind of unhappy the next day, and our painter, our artist, came into the office by chance that day. Chuck Hilliard was our artist for a bunch of the work at the foundation, but it was between stints in the big house. And I don't mean he had a big house, I mean it was the big house. But he's a great artist, and he came in and he'd been out for a while and needed some money. Said, "Is there anything I can do for you?" And I was just thinking about that. And what could he paint? And I just looked at this the night before. I'd shown that slide that you had seen. And I said, well, you could print our version of that. You can paint it. And so this is the painting he did. Of course, you can see we have our own angelic figure rolling up the telegraph line. You can see the Cuyahoga River burning in the background. You can see the nuclear plants spewing stuff. And then you have Indian people coming back onto the land. And I said, well, Chuck, you got this guy down there with this like AR-15. Chuck was kind of a gangbanger too. So you have to understand, there's some of that in the picture, his personal experience. I said, and the bear's in the background. He said he's tired of getting shot at, so he's waiting to see what happens. So anyway, we've had such a demand for this. The New Mexico Historical Society blew it up into, I don't know, probably the back wall there. And has it as a central piece to their exhibition on Indian people. You can go online and buy this on a t-shirt, a hoodie, anything you want to put it on. And we get a few proceeds from it.
Excuse me, I'm going to have to break in, but we would love to carry this on for another hour. Thank you so very much.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
I'm sorry to run over, but there was lots more we could have wanted to hear from Cris. Please return next Sunday when Allison Shorkey will give us a progress report on the rebuilding of Lake Street after the murder of George Floyd. Please remember Saturday night to turn your clocks back so you get here on time. Thank you very much and appreciate your coming.